Hello, a very warm welcome to wherever you're joining us from today. Welcome to the latest installment on the eCOA educational series brought to you by the Critical Path Institute's eCOA consortium. My name's Scottie Kern. I currently serve as the Executive Director of the eCOA consortium, and my role today is to moderate a very knowledgeable, experienced, and honest panel of experts in the field of bring your own device. This is our first eCOA clinic, and hopefully the term is it's kind of transparent that the intent here is really to open the table for colleagues within the clinical research community to bring questions, observations, comments around the always intriguing and somewhat enigmatic thing that is bring your own device for the capture of electronic clinical outcome assessment data. At the point of registering for the event, thank you to the significant numbers of people that have registered. We did make it available as an option to pre-submit questions, and thank you to those that did so. We've got quite a lot of early material to work with, but this is a live event. So we would actively encourage you to, again, get involved, post your questions and comments and observations as well. We'll try and share as many comments that are relevant to the discussion as we can. But yeah, the more questions and answers we get, the more questions we get, the more interactive and engaging hopefully the session will be. But thank you for your time today. So before we run into the introductions and just set a bit of context for today's session, a bit of housekeeping. You will all be muted, so this won't be a verbal interaction today. We're going to do everything via the wondrous medium of hands. The presentation is going to be recorded and it will be made available on the eCOA consortium webpage very soon after the event. One thing I should stress is that in registering for the event, you may have noticed that the original end time was 30 minutes past the hour. Given the volume of advanced questions we got and the likelihood that we're going to get quite a high volume of questions during the event, we are going to actually continue through to 45 minutes past the hour. So if you do have to drop off, I would encourage you to check in on the recording, which, as I said, will be posted very shortly afterwards. Anyone who's registered for the event, we will be sending a notification of when the recording is available for you to review. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A function within Zoom. Do not use chat for any questions. The chat function is solely there in case you're having some technical issues or you observe something that isn't quite right. But if you have a question that you'd like the panel to engage with, please use the Q&A and I will moderate them accordingly from there. So again, any technical issues, please use the chat feature, questions, Q&A. Excellent. We do need to acknowledge that the Critical Path Institute as a whole does receive funding from the US Food and Drug Administration. And consequently, we would like to confirm the disclaimer that the views expressed by those involved in the presentation are those of themselves as individuals, including myself, and should not be attributed to their respective organizations, including the FDA and the Critical Path Institute. And the content of the slides, while brief, is the property of the individual presenters. So a little word on the eCOA consortium. If you're not familiar with us, we are a pre-competitive alliance of currently 24 eCOA technology or allied service providers. There'll be a lot of very familiar names to you all, I'm sure, amongst our current membership, which is always evolving. And our mission really to advance the science of clinical outcomes assessment and electronic capture of that. Within one of our mission statement, we have this delivering educational opportunities component, and that's the kind of promise we're trying to help fulfill today, is creating that environment, that opportunity for you out there dealing with clinical research execution to ask to ask questions or raise issues of concern. So let me now introduce our esteemed panel. I'll run through this quickly so we can get maximum time to deal with the Q&A. We have Chris Barden, the Senior Director of Commercial Alliances from Kayentis, Lisa Charlton, the Vice President of Product Management from Science 37, Kelly Dumais, the Director of eCOA Science from Clario, Karl McEvoy, Product Director and the Product Innovation Team at YPrime, and Flo Mowlem, the Vice President of Science at ObvioHealth. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your panel. Please interrogate them as you see fit. And we'll get moving with the first question which is actually going to be a combination of two questions we received in advance from, and please forgive the pronunciations, I will doubtless be way wide of the mark on a few of these, but Huda Shalhoub from Bayer and Kevin Schnippel asked generally the same question in terms of what is the latest in terms of BYOD usage in clinical trials. And just before actually maybe we respond, dwell on that, so can we go to the next slide, please, Christian? I just want to be very clear in terms of the questions we received, is that we had some of the questions that weren't really focused on COA, electronic COA data capture. So what might be helpful actually before we actually address that first question is look at the definition of bring your own device that we have within the Critical Path Institute's eCOA lexicon, which is a resource we've developed available via the eCOA Consortium's webpage, which is trying to align on terminology that is relevant to eCOA usage. And what we've defined, and that's something actually is generated not just by the eCOA Consortium, it's in collaboration with the sponsor representatives from the PRO Consortium as well at CPATH. And we define BYOD as the practice of study participants using their own personal devices to collect, record, and transmit eCOA data in clinical trials. So with that in mind, let's come back to the question from Huda and Kevin. What is the latest in terms of BYOD usage in clinical trials, and is growth being observed? So let's come to the commercial expert on our panel. Chris, would you mind taking first stab at that?
Sure, happy to. And it's an interesting question because I think we're at a nice crossroads for it. I think at the moment there's a lot of positive trends that I think we can draw upon. I think if you just look at the conversations we've had over the last couple of years within the eCOA Consortium, all those members are showing more and more BYOD components within their studies, and even vendors outside the consortium are also talking about delivering more BYOD solutions. So generally we're seeing it used a lot more across all phases of clinical trials and in a lot more therapeutic areas, a lot broader than we've seen before, and across lots of different endpoints, including primary endpoints. And we are now running studies in phase 3 with global studies with primary endpoints being used with BYOD modality. So I think there's a lot of good trends. I think also just looking from the questions that we get from teams that are looking to, can I run BYOD on my study? It's moved away from the innovation teams. It's moved away from the early adopters who were, at the forefront 10 years ago of trying to see if we can do BYOD. And it's now more study teams. And I saw this at the beginning of when ePro was adopted. And now the study teams and operation teams are really trying to understand the dynamics of the studies and how the BYOD affects the operationally. So now we're at that level. I do think that we're an influx, and we'll start to see more and more BYOD modalities used alongside provision devices, and we'll see a growth continue further on.
Thank you, Chris. Any other comments from the panel? Okay, let's move on to the second question then. Thank you, Kevin and Hugh. The second question we got from Jenya Antonova. And this is basically coming from the trying to understand the regulatory perspective right now. What are the positions of the regulators? And Jenya's question is focused on FDA. Have data collected via eCOA resulted in FDA labeling language? So we assume that question's in the context of BYOD approaches to capturing eCOA data. So do we know of any successes in terms of use of labels, and what is the general regulatory perspective on BYOD now? So who should we come to for that one? Let's do, excuse me, Kelly.
Sure, thanks, Karl. Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. So yeah, I think historically this has been perceived as one of the barriers to BYOD adoption, not knowing if it would be accepted by regulatory agencies. But now to date, I think many regulatory agencies have acknowledged BYOD as an acceptable data collection method, and it's even evident in their formal guidances that have been released within the past couple of years. So when we think of FDA, the FDA's digital health technologies guidance that came out in draft even a couple of years ago now does mention BYOD as an option in the context of all digital health technologies, but also within eCOA. It also even states the potential advantages of BYOD, such as reducing burden. The FDA's patient-focused drug development guidance series, the guidance 3 that came out in draft form last year, that also mentions BYOD as an option. And then even the EMA's guidance on computerized systems that was finalized just this year also mentions ePro data that may be captured using privately owned devices, and has a number of different recommendations regarding, implementing BYOD within that EMA guidance. So there really has been, even within the formal guidances, talk of BYOD as a good option. And so as part of our CPATH eCOA consortium, BYOD working group, we even have engaged FDA representatives around conversations. And, while those conversations are not official stances, but rather individuals thinking, I think the main message from the FDA that we've heard is that it's really just the quality of the data that's important, right? So not so much the device or the method, whether it's an app or provision device or iOS device or Android device, but really the quality of the data needs to be there. And that's really what they're interested in. And as for whether data collected using BYOD has supported a labeling claim, I think that is the $1 million question. I think it's safe to say that it's something that has to have happened. And we know for sure that the COVID vaccines trials, for example, those protocols stated the use of BYOD and for accepted vaccines currently. And I know Clario, and Chris just mentioned that his company as well. I mean, we've all been supporting collection of phase 3 primary endpoint data using BYOD. So it is definitely happening. And the eCOA consortium has actually been trying to create a database, right? And a list of drug approvals where BYOD have supported a labeling claim. So if you are a sponsor and would like to share your experience and contribute to that database, you can reach out to Scottie, and Scottie chime in if you want to say anything further on that. But I think bottom line, that there is growing acknowledgement of BYOD by regulators.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you for promoting our the BYD database that we've been trying to develop, which would require sponsors to share information in terms of their usage of those approaches. But yeah, and obviously we did actually publish an article in Applied Clinical Trials earlier this year, highlighting a conversation that we had within something called an eCOA forum, which we held at the end of the Patient Reported Outcomes Patient Reported Outcome Consortium annual workshop back in April of this year, where we had conversations with FDA, and it's very clear that the acceptance is there. The same burden of evidence of proof of acceptance is there in terms of usage of these systems, but there's no specific obstacle at all coming from FDA, is there?
No. Yeah.
Okay. Any other comments on that? Now let's jump straight onto our next question set, which again is going to be a sort of combination of two very similar questions. The first of which was from Rebecca Tamalti, and second, Kerry Brady from ADV. We're looking at the kind of like the global context, the global perspective here. Are there any regions better or worse in terms of accepting BYOD? And a particular call out, and I want to recognize the question we received from our colleague Anna Chilongo as well, about the specific issues around China. And are there any other countries aside from China that we know there's a challenge around BYOD usage? So let's, Karl, would you mind taking the first hit on that one?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Scottie, and thanks for the questions. I think this, again, a lot like some of the responses we've given already, we're at a point where I think things are changing, and changing for the better. We see an increase in the amount of publications, particularly from the regulatory bodies, where we talk about it, the use of BYOD more specifically than just eCOA. So I think, a year or two ago, we probably still had this combination of questions come up quite a lot. I think one thing COVID has given us is perhaps the freedom to explore some of these strategies a little better. We hear less about sort of a complete roadblock for countries and not accepting BYOD. We're starting to see evidence within the literature of small-scale studies, for example, being run in China using BYOD. So I think we're getting there. I think it's less about the flat-out no and more about practical considerations for that patient population. I think, to call out the Africa piece specifically, we do see anecdotal evidence that, for example, there are places in the continent of Africa that are better connected than central London when it comes to things like 4G connectivity, because from an infrastructure perspective, they've skipped landlines completely, right? So technology-wise, connectivity is there to use BYOD. Perhaps a more practical question in that scenario is the demographic of the patient population. Do we have devices which patients themselves will use that could be suitable? So although BYOD wouldn't necessarily be suitable because of the patient demographic, we might have to provision devices to get devices to a good enough standard. It doesn't mean that BYOD wouldn't be accepted, for example. We hear the same stories about, the use of Google within China. Things like that are changing. Google have their own specific China policies now where they're looking to essentially have the Google Play Store more broadly accepted. So I think we're starting to see an evolution. We're starting to see change. And the more studies we see with published data supporting BYOD, I think the more that helps us to facilitate the conversations and carry out BYOD properly within those regions.
Karl, go ahead, Scottie. I wanted to add a couple points to the global question, thinking about it from an operational perspective, and this is solely based on my experience within the industry, but at the heart of it, BYOD is critical to patient centricity because it gives the patients the option. Optionality is really big within the industry now. Can I use my own device or can I use a provision device, and what is my preference? Within the US, BYOD is I'm not going to say it's almost akin to the provision device. We have a very high level of smartphone saturation. There's a significant probability of connectivity as well. When you get into a global environment, of course, there's many more areas, many differing laws, privacy, etc. So as in the role of a buyer or a user of BYOD, there's some level of prioritization that needs to be thought of in terms of the operational aspect of globalization of a BYOD solution that is dependent upon the technology and the technology that the vendor uses to support BYOD. And let me give you an example for the crowd. So for example, some BYOD applications rely on making the package really small that you can download because they want that data download in the very beginning of getting the app off the App Store to be really small for the participants, because data plans aren't necessarily unlimited as much so within a global setting. So the app may sit on the App Store with a small presence for megabytes. But one way to achieve this is by reducing the amount of days that you can achieve through an offline capacity. So when you're thinking about global, when you're thinking about connectivity, I think within your plans and your prioritization, you also have to take into consideration, how are we going to reimburse for data plans? How is offline going to be supported by this vendor? Am I doing an exploratory endpoint, not necessarily a primary endpoint, and I don't need full offline capabilities, or maybe I can supplement with a potential MiFi. So along with the optionality of supporting BYOD, and even some of these issues come up with provision, you also have to prioritize, how do I want to think about reimbursement, data plans, connectivity, and offline in order to operationalize outside of the US.
Great points, and I think an important point, Lisa, for the audience to hear, that there is some provider-specific consideration as well around how the system's actually made available. But just to sort of underline, are we aware of any specific challenges other than China? Africa's been mentioned. Is there anything the panel has experience-wise that countries that may be a particular issue?
Not
China.
necessarily, Scottie. I mean, we've often heard strange anecdotal evidence of cultural considerations. So not necessarily, again, regulatory, but we think about, average earnings in a particular country. And so provisioned or BYOD becomes a concern there, because if an individual who doesn't earn a lot of money loses a device which they deem is really expensive, there's a sort of a cultural onus in certain parts of the world that they feel responsible to replace that. Now, obviously, that's not what we look to do within a trial. We chalk that down to a loss. And similarly, if BYOD, as we said earlier, it's physically capable within a country given that technology, but maybe from a demographic perspective, the patients just don't have the devices that are suitable. I think that's probably, again, to Lisa's point, a more practical consideration. Certainly preference shows that, you know, where there is a choice, patients often tend to go for BYOD over a provision device. It's one less thing to carry. But again, it's not always so clear-cut. It's often driven really about what is the best choice for the patient within that population, within you know, the confines of that trial.
Absolutely. Thank you, Karl, for that additional detail. And I want to acknowledge a comment from Alistair Gifford-Moore, who's pointed out something which I don't think is specific to BYOD, but Israel is obviously a known challenge for import and export. But, you know, that's a more general, I think, issue that in other countries in Latin America, South America, there might be a particular issue. But Alistair, thank you for that comment. Let's come on to the next question. We have from Chance Cheney from YPrime. So hopefully, Karl, someone familiar to you. If it's not, it could be an interesting discussion. But the question is, how should we be addressing screen report approvals with differing device formats? The whole thing around EC, Ethics Committee, IRB submissions is obviously a topic which I think we'll explore next year as a group. But is there, what should we be looking for specifically? What's the best approach where BYOD is involved? Flo, would you mind taking a stab at that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you went to the heart of what I was going to say at the start, is that there's generally conversations going on about whether we need to be submitting screen reports of patient-reported outcome measures to IRBs and ethics committees. They are not differing in the content of what they are showing compared to the actual paper measure. So I think there's one aspect there. And then I think the other bit is if we're submitting them to copyright holders in the approval of the implementation. And I think there's an educational aspect needed around this, that as eCOA vendors, when you're designing your app or your platform for BYOD, you, from my experience anyway, you're designing it with the smallest device in mind. The smallest device that you would advise is used for BYOD. And then any device that's bigger than that, it's going to scale up. So if you can be confident that it is formatted in a way that you're maintaining the measurement properties of that instrument in the electronic format on BYOD on that minimum device size, then you can be confident that it's going to be the same as the device gets bigger. Like you're not going to be impacting that formatting in a negative way. So I definitely think if we think about BYOD versus provisioned, in that sense, I don't think that there's really a big difference and a need for concern. And I think maybe it's an educational activity that we need to undertake with copyright holders.
Absolutely agree. And I think the general topic of this is something we're definitely going to be revisiting in the future. Thank you, Flo, for that, and for a chance for the question. Katie Benjamin from Merck has asked kind of two-part question, really. And I think we'll only be able to address one part of it. Please address the validation and also methods to measure meaningful change for data collected via commercial devices. Now, I think the meaningful change piece is probably a little bit beyond the scope. This is a mechanism of administering our PROs, but let's focus on the kind of validation piece. What does that look like? What's validation of BYOD devices? Karl, would you mind taking a first hit at that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's an interesting question, and as I think about it, I'm sort of trying to avoid the conversation of equivalence and statistical equivalence and conceptual equivalence and all the stuff we've talked about in a validation sense traditionally. I think we've seen enough data to support the fact that whether it's electronic or paper, we know we can support the fact that people don't answer these questionnaires any differently. The quality of data we get is at the very least comparable and very often better. I think that's a sort of an important point to highlight, and it's probably not documented enough. And I think as the consortium, we're trying hard to make sure that that is the case. I think the bit that I always go back to is the concept of interest and the context of use. And I won't quote people from various government agencies, but there have been plenty of them who've said exactly that on calls with this group and on calls with, I'm sure, plenty of people who have joined. Regulatory bodies, broadly speaking, aren't looking at what we're implementing, how we're implementing it. They're looking at what we're implementing. So if the questionnaire being used is valid for that patient population, there's an absolutely incredibly strong argument to be made that if you're administering it in a sensible way, following best practice, following all the guidelines that everybody on this call will be familiar with, well, then we're not actually impacting the validity of an instrument at all. I think it's kind of, it's better for us as a group, I think, to take that as the approach to these things. Certainly things like meaningful change, we get into a very different conversation. We start to go down a slightly deeper rabbit hole there. But again, for me, it comes back to the patient population, getting the right questionnaire in the right context of use.
Absolutely, Karl. Any other thoughts on that? Okay, wonderful answer, Karl. Holistic as ever. Thank you for the question. Katie, another sort of combined question here, which is on the general theme of privacy. Obviously a concern that repeatedly comes up in the context of BYOD, which is, we're using someone's own device. And what does that mean? So Peter Trask from Genentech and David Wickham from Roche have asked a fairly similar question in terms of how do BYOD capable eCOA providers keep up with the evolving data privacy regulations? And particularly in terms of Peter's question, looks at the European expectations. So always an interesting discussion. Lisa, have you got any thoughts on this?
Sure. I can provide my thoughts. So I do believe privacy is one area of focus for vendors across the board. That is a very, very strong area of focus. We see a lot with modern day apps using the device protocols in order to enhance the biometrics or the fingerprint scanning, or potentially accessing the camera in order to collect images in a decentralized trial manner. One way in which across the industry we stay abreast of all of this is to, or oversight of it is to include information, of course, in our informed consent, or to add information into our privacy statements that are part of our solutions or our software. Addressing privacy, there's a lot of overlap in between the provision device as well as the BYOD approach. And that's why I really think that vendors have a strong handle on it. And most of them having a chief privacy officer or someone who is responsible for asking or answering those questions as they come in from vendors. But I do have to go back and say that I do believe how and what is accomplished does come down to the specific vendor and the software and what they have in terms of being allowed or locked down based on the customer base that they are supporting. So there is definitely some where they'll use the camera functionality, but they'll have the geolocation turned off in terms of using their own phones. So my recommendation to everyone is always to have these questions, because I don't think that there is a one size fits all across all vendors.
Yeah, that's a great point, Lisa. Any other thoughts on the topic? Okay, thank you so much again, both Peter and David, for the question. Our next question we have, and this is quite a general question, but an important one to address. But and to a degree, we've talked about perceived challenges already. There's a lot of benefits to BYOD. No one's asking about those. So, but let's focus on the question at hand from Sri Balaji from Eli Lilly. What are the challenges we can expect to face when using BYOD? Flo, how about you take a first stab at what the challenges may be and how we prepare for them?
So I think it's important to set the context, first of all, that most of us, and I certainly would never recommend 100% BYOD for a trial. So it's to go back to what Lisa was saying earlier about optionality. So we're not saying it's one way or the other. It's about having the option for participants to use their own device, or if they're not comfortable using their own device or they don't have a suitable one, then we would provision one for them. So I think that's one perceived challenge, is what if they don't have a suitable device or don't want to use it? And then the response would be, well, we'll provision as well. But in most instances, you find that people are more comfortable using their own device. They're familiar with it. They're used to it. It means they don't have to carry two devices around. Then we come to aspects, and I think inherently these are perceived challenges about there being less control over BYOD in the sense that the eCOA vendor, the app is downloaded on the participant's own device, not a lockdown device, and perhaps they might turn the notifications off or mute them. But I think if we think about the comparison to provisioned or to paper, I don't think it's necessarily justified that BYOD is more risky in that sense. You know, they're carrying 2 devices around, they might not charge it, they might leave it behind, and so they're not going to get those notifications anyway. They might delete the app, but they might not use the provision device, they might lose the paper, they might not complete it. And also, I think we need to give people credit, like they've chosen to participate in a clinical trial of which it should have been communicated very clearly that data collection is part of that. And it's a very selfless act in many ways to take part in a clinical trial. So I think saying they're just going to turn off the notifications or not complete data or turn the device off or delete the app, I think that's going to be the exception, not the rule. So I think there's those elements that are challenges. And I think then people perceive, again, sponsors, etc., that the regulatory acceptance of data from BYOD is going to be a challenge. And I hope that we've addressed that throughout this panel discussion today, that regulators are very open to it. And that the data is accepted. And I think just to combine, there was a question from Cindy as well about other studies apart from vaccine that have used data from PROs and BYOD on labelling claims. And I think anecdotally, we're all aware of it, but as eCOA vendors, we are not at liberty to share those specific studies because they're not our studies. And what we really need is for sponsors to be sharing that information and being transparent about it, so that we can really move past this in the industry and think about patient centricity at the forefront.
And thank you for addressing the other question there, Flo. And again, I won't apologise really for wanting to emphasise the fact that the sense of maybe hesitation and reluctance around BYOD, a lot of it is largely unjustified for reasons this panel has explored, but being able to actually articulate that this is happening, that you as providers are implementing BYOD components, options within clinical trials, is a really important thing to try and get out there, and we stand ready to try and support that. But are there any other considerations? Because I think this is an important topic. Any other things that, based on your experience, we should be prepared for in terms of exploring the potential of BYOD?
Yeah, I've got maybe a point or two, Scottie, on that one. If you're looking at how you're going to run a global study, for example, if you're going to run 20 or 30 different countries in your study, which is quite typical within a larger study, and how many patients are going to be in each country. So you're looking about how you're going to have a backup strategy, whether that's a web backup strategy or a provision backup strategy alongside the BYOD, because you never want to impact recruitment. You never want to impact lots of other dynamics. So we can't assume that everybody's going to be, yes, we're going to absolutely take BYOD, but we know that the trends are that they want to take it more, but we've got to plan for the worst as well. So what we do in clinical trials is we plan very well. Sometimes we overplan, but I think what we do is we know how to back up those solutions as well. So that's, you look at it as a totality of the study. So you're looking at the participant dynamics, where everything is located, and make sure you've got a plan to cover all bases.
So I would like to add on to that, Chris, too, in terms of backup. I think that if we focus on the holistic nature of BYOD, like the equivalency studies that have shown using one device can be equivalent to the other, or the backup strategy can become very fluid, and we can use it to overcome challenges. So take this scenario where a participant arrives at a site, their BYOD solution requires an email address or a login to the App Store. They're not prepared. In order to get over that hurdle, a provision device can be provided, because all sites should have at least one provision device. And then eventually they can be migrated back to a BYOD solution or their own personal device for a longer term data collection. So if we rely on the information that has been published so far, we can get a much more enhanced strategy to include solutions such as a provision and an own personal device as backup, in order to make it easy for the patient to not only enroll, but to be retained within the clinical trial.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Greg,
I'll
please.
jump in quickly to also emphasize that it's definitely the options, right, that have been said many times, but to try to make clear the point. So maybe some countries might have less connectivity, or maybe certain cultures or countries might prefer provisioned and not want to use their own device. If you have one of those countries, it doesn't mean that BYOD is not a strategy for you. It just means provisioning more devices in those countries. So none of these have even led to the fact that, okay, you shouldn't use BYOD in that study because you have that country or because you have that patient population, because there still could be patients within that patient population or within that country that can and want to use their own device. So again, it's all about optionality. And none of these are really kind of true barriers that you can't use that. It's just providing the option, to have a provision device as a backup.
So Kelly, it doesn't have to be an all or none strategy, right?
Right. Exactly. That's what I mean. Yeah, BYOD, as Flo had mentioned, it's never 100% BYOD. So yeah, it's all about having both as
Great
options.
stuff. Really appreciate your contributions there, guys. The next question we have is going to go to the topic of developing BYD systems. So this is Claire Trenery from Adelphi Valleys is interested to understand the timeline savings or otherwise of choosing a BYOD approach. So in terms of developing the system, developing ready for a trial, what are we seeing there? Karl, in your role, I know it's something that you look at. Care to take a first attempt at that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question because it's another one of those that is sort of context driven. So on the face of it, I think this will vary generally between vendors and possibly even between studies, depending on the questionnaires you're using. But what I would say is, from my own perspective, there's not a huge difference in time difference between setup for BYOD versus BYOD or provisioned. I think where we start to see subtle changes can be around things like adapting text from a paper questionnaire to an electronic questionnaire, which we've sort of seen in the past, and we're kind of getting to a point where we don't see it very often now. Sometimes we see instrument authors who have maybe a slight challenge with the concept of using bring your own device, not because of the bring your own device piece, but because of the creation of their intellectual property in an application, which is sometimes very easy to explain to individuals and let them realize that that's not the case. And sometimes certain individuals are a little bit more sort of steadfast in their approach to maybe sticking to a known and validated eCOA system. So it's a kind of a tricky one. I think sometimes it should, in my mind, be largely the same. Licensing can sometimes get a little trickier when you're thinking about specifics, broadening out the modality to BYOD versus a specific device. We think of some of the qualification programs for certain qualification steps for the use of certain questionnaires electronically. That can slow things down a little bit. In my time as a sponsor, in practice, it probably didn't always work that way. There was probably a little bit more of a lag when it came to BYOD, but largely, I think that was sort of a historic thing. It was more about teams not being used to doing BYOD. So the extra time taken was time engaging with regulators. It was asking eCOA vendors about their experience with BYOD. It was reaching out to colleagues who were in maybe different organizations, asking, have you done this through BYOD? What success have you had with regulatory submission? We're starting to get all that information back now. So I think the internal work that we have to do to assess, should we do BYOD, I think is happening differently. So perhaps a more long-winded answer than is needed, but I think from my perspective, there should be no real difficult reason why it should be an extended timeline for BYOD.
Fair point. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I just have one to add, and that comes down to, I guess, the stage in terms of what Karl was saying for the implementation and the building of the software. Outside of the authors, the steps should be the same whether you're provisioned or BYOD. When it gets down to the stage of what I would call provisioning, is where there may be differences based on the technology or the tech stack that is used. So if the vendor needs to build iOS and Android separately, there could be a release of one version and then the second version to follow. So there may be a time difference between the two. But additionally, how they apply their app to the App Store as well. Is it going with a full study build, or is it just an app with on the App Store where then the first step is that it's a download of the study. Our experience has shown that we're seeing differences in terms of timing based on Apple or Android in terms of their acceptance of those types of software into the app into the store, whether it's a study specific build or just the general app itself. So then those are, again, questions that are very vendor specific, but could be leading to these industry-wide questions of, is there differences in timelines?
Great point, Lisa. Thank you for that additional detail. And if I may, Lisa, we'll stay with you as we've got a sort of question I think really sits in your field of expertise from, again, David Wickham is the lucky individual who gets 2 questions today. What are the pros and cons of app versus web diary implementations?
So at the heart of it, app will use native applications use the things on the device to enhance the experience for the participant. So you could have in-app notifications or that could potentially impact compliance. As I mentioned earlier, you can build the app from a software perspective to use the biometrics that are available within the iPhone or within the Android, or if the camera functionality. In terms of web, this one's really exciting for me. I get excited talking about the technology aspect, but in terms of web, you're going to have to rely on other forms of communication or alerting, such as SMS notifications, which may have an impact in your global setting, or email. But that also comes down to patient preference. I'm much more likely to respond to my emails than anything else. But the one advantage in web has the creation of what is called progressive web app, which has really gone great lengths in terms of usability and being able to accommodate the formatting of screens that is very specific to the eCOA industry. So that's a technology that's up and coming, and you may not have as many people who know how to code in that language, but it's something that is very usable. So in conclusion, like, communication's key. What other level of complexity that you want to use the device for is more enhanced with the native applications over the web. But each one has a fit for purpose based on the therapeutic area and the age population that you're looking at.
Right. Thank you so much, Lisa. I think we got really time for maybe a couple more questions before we're going to need to wrap up. A quick one from, again, from Alistair Gifford Moore. BYOD guidance is needed for sponsors. Do we have a central information resource? Alistair, please keep a lookout for the channels from the CPATH, from Critical Path Institute. We're working on something right now, a project that Lisa is actually leading brilliantly. It's a collaboration with sponsors in the PRO consortium. There'll be a resource available in the new year, which we'll direct everyone to, and probably we'll talk about in a similar session to this. So thank you so much for that question. Flo, we got a question from our esteemed industry colleague, Joe Dustin. We hear BYOD can easily be implemented if planned for early enough during protocol design and endpoint development. At what regulatory meeting specifically should a BYOD strategy be presented? And I assume this question's in the context of FDA. Could you take that one, Flo?
Yeah, so I think for this, I personally almost remove the BYOD element and think, you know, everything starts from early on in your protocol development and how you're designing your study. And I mean, that's the ideal anyway. We shouldn't be, you know, it's not just what data do you want to collect, but how are you going to collect it? And I think we should be thinking about that as early as possible. And I think lots of vendors see sponsors wanting to do digital data capture, but it's kind of an afterthought a lot of the time. So they're not thinking about it early on in protocol development. So I think irrelevant of BYOD or provisioned, I think it's about what is your method of data capture. And if it's electronic, thinking about how that facilitates your study design and the endpoints that you want to capture. I can't personally speak to what specific regulatory meeting around a BYOD strategy, but again, I think it's more around just a data collection strategy. How are you going to be collecting your data to reduce the amount of missing data, to have patient centricity and optionality built into your protocol design and the way you're collecting data. So I think it just comes with your protocol and your data collection sort of methods and your plan as a whole.
Right. Thank you so much, Flo, and thank you so much to the panel as a whole. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. We have an awful lot more questions have predictably come in, as ever, in the last 10 minutes of the session. So we are going to do this topic again in a similar format in the new year. We'll save all these questions and we'll have those addressed in the next session. Maybe we have to do this on a regular basis, the BYOD clinic, to try until we get this thing moving. But thank you so much, everyone, for your questions. So we'd like to just move on to the next slide, please, Christian, just to illustrate that we've got other sessions of this type coming up. This was the first eCOA clinic. We'll be having our first eCOA masterclass, which will be basically a traditional type of webinar talking about the seminal paper, to be honest, that we were fortunate enough to get published in Value in Health a little earlier this year around the best practices for the electronic migration implementation of PRO measures, of which Flo was the lead author. Q1, probably mid to late February, we're going to be doing a webinar on that. Please look out for our standard channels. We'll also be examining eCOA libraries. That's going to be quite a provocative one. If anyone's involved in library management or translations, licensing, please join that one. It'll be a good one. And in Q2, we'll do another one on eCOA backups. We touched on that a little bit today, but that's always a provocative subject. If you're not already, I encourage you to join our eCOA Connect, our eCOA Consortium's LinkedIn group. Get involved in the debate there. Our webpage, cpath.org programs eCOA, is available for all the resources we generated. And if you've got any general comments or suggestions of things we should attack, we should approach, we should examine within these types of sessions, ecoec@cpath.org. Please drop us a line and we'll build it into our future schedule. And with that, we'll close things up. Thank you again so much for everyone for your time. Again, please share our ideas. We're about providing this sort of service to the clinical research community in the context of eCOA. So if you have ideas, please bring them to us. Thanks again to all the panelists, my CPAF colleagues, for coordinating, and we look forward to seeing you in Q1 to talk about migration and implementation of PRO measures. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.